The air was dense with the acrid smell of burning metal, and the sky glowed an eerie red. Buildings that once housed laughter and life were now reduced to jagged skeletons, a dark testament to the unending cycle of war. Amidst the wreckage of their shattered city, Leora could feel the hum of her heartbeat reverberate in her ears, almost drowned out by the endless symphony of gunfire. She leaned against the crumbling wall, gasping for breath as she glanced at her companion. Isaac, do you think there's any point to all of this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Isaac, covered in grime and blood, turned to her with a pained smile. If there's no point, then we have to make one, he said, his gaze hardened by years of fighting and losing. His eyes seemed to carry a weight that transcended the horrors of the present, a look filled with a heavy burden of hope and despair. We're not fighting just for us. We're fighting for those who come after. We can't let them live this hell. Leora sighed, closing her eyes as if she could block out the war-torn landscape around them. Deep down, she knew he was right, but every lost friend, every child they couldn't save, chipped away at her belief that a better future was even possible. She opened her eyes, staring at the thick, swirling clouds overhead. She didn't know if the sun still existed behind those clouds. It felt like it had abandoned them. We have to keep going, Isaac said, his voice more insistent. The genetic memory experiments, they're our only chance to break this cycle, to learn from the future, and to finally win. Leora bit her lip. The experiments were a desperate gamble. Rumors spoke of people glimpsing fragments of lives not yet lived, memories buried deep within their DNA, memories from the future. Scientists believed these fragments were echoes from possible timelines carried across dimensions and time itself. It was as if the universe, in some cruel irony, had embedded its own solution to humanity's suffering within them, waiting for someone bold enough to discover it. Do you ever wonder about those futures we see? Leora asked, her voice thick with emotion. I see flashes, Isaac. Children I've never had, places I've never seen. I feel nostalgia for things that don't even exist. Her eyes glazed over as tears threatened to spill. I'm tired of all this pain. I want those dreams to be real, not just broken fragments in my head. Isaac swallowed hard, reaching out to touch her hand gently. His fingers were cold against her skin, but the gesture anchored her. It reminded her that she wasn't alone in this chaos. Me too, Leora, he said, his voice trembling. I see them too. I think that's why we can't give up. Because if we're seeing these things, maybe it means they're possible. We just have to be brave enough to reach them. Suddenly, a noise broke through their moment of vulnerability, the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. Isaac's face twisted with urgency, and he pulled Leora to her feet. They're coming, he hissed. We have to move now. The two of them darted through the narrow alleyways, their feet pounding against the cracked pavement. The city was a labyrinth of destruction, a maze of memories haunted by old echoes, some of triumph, but mostly regret. Every building they passed held ghosts of moments that might have been. There was the school that Leora remembered from her visions. In one memory, she could see children running and playing, their laughter like music. In the reality of now, all she could hear was the endless, mechanical clank of war engines. They turned a corner, and there, amidst the ruins, stood their destination, the crumbling remnants of what had once been a research facility. The air was thick with tension as they approached the entrance, Isaac pressing a code into a barely functioning keypad. The door creaked open, revealing the dim interior, where a group of rebels huddled together in the darkness. Dr. Ria, the lead scientist behind the genetic memory experiments, looked up as they entered. Her eyes were sunken, the toll of countless sleepless nights evident in her frail frame. Still, there was a fire in her gaze that refused to die. You made it, she said, relief evident in her voice. We don't have much time. We need to continue the connection process to access more memories. Isaac nodded. We're ready, he said, Glancing at Liora, she hesitated for a moment, then gave a determined nod. Dr. Ria gestured to a pair of chairs surrounded by wires and blinking machines. Liora and Isaac sat down, and as Ria connected the electrodes to their temples, Liora's heart pounded in her chest. She closed her eyes, feeling the hum of the machine vibrate through her body. You might experience disorientation, Dr. Ria warned, her voice distant. But remember, these are your memories from futures that could be. Try to hold on to them. They're the key to breaking the cycle. With that, the world around Liora began to dissolve. Colors bled together, and the sensation of falling swept over her, pulling her into a vast abyss. Then, abruptly, she was somewhere else. The sounds of war faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in a warm breeze. She looked around and saw a field of golden grass, stretching endlessly in every direction. Liora felt a presence beside her. She turned and saw a young boy's face filled with innocence, his eyes wide with wonder. He looked up at her, smiling brightly, and Leora's heart ached with a fierce, almost unbearable love. She recognized him, even though she had never seen him before. Mom, the boy said, his voice a soft whisper in the wind. Leora gasped, her eyes filling with tears. She knelt down, pulling the boy into her arms. The warmth of his tiny body against her own was overwhelming. For a moment, everything else melted away: the war, the pain, the endless cycle of destruction. All that mattered was this moment, this child who felt so impossibly real. I love you, she whispered, her voice cracking. I love you so much. The boy pulled back slightly, his eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond his years. You have to be brave, Mommy said. You have to make sure I get to be real someday. Leora's heart clenched, and before she could respond, the world around her shifted again. The golden field faded, replaced by a cold, dark room. She was standing in front of a mirror, her reflection staring back at her, only it wasn't her. The woman in the mirror looked like her, but older, her eyes haunted by loss. Leora felt a chill run down her spine as the woman spoke. You have to learn from us, the reflection said, her voice echoing in the emptiness. We failed. We let fear and hatred consume us. But you can be different. You can break the cycle. Suddenly the mirror shattered, the shards swirling around her like a storm. Leora cried out, her hands reaching out to shield herself, but there was nothing to hold on to. She was falling again, tumbling through a kaleidoscope of memories, some filled with hope, others with despair. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. Leora's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She was back in the research facility, the dim light flickering overhead. Isaac was beside her, his face pale, sweat dripping from his forehead. Did you see it? He asked, his voice hoarse. Leora nodded, tears streaming down her face. I saw him, she whispered. I saw our son, and I saw what happens if we fail. Isaac reached out, taking her hand in his. His grip was tight, desperate. Then we can't fail, he said, his voice filled with determination. We have to do whatever it takes. Dr. Ria stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. What did you see? She asked, her voice barely audible. Leora took a deep breath, her heart aching with the weight of what she had experienced. I saw a future where we win, she said, but I also saw how close we came to losing it all. We have to be careful. We have to make the right choices, even if they're hard. Isaac nodded, his gaze unwavering. We'll make them, he said. Together. The group fell silent, the enormity of their task pressing down on them like a heavy weight. The war outside raged on, the echoes of gunfire a constant reminder of what was at stake. But in that moment there was also hope, a fragile, flickering hope that maybe, just maybe, they could finally break the cycle. Leora looked at Isaac, her heart swelling with love and determination. She thought of the boy in her vision, his bright smile, his innocent eyes. She thought of the countless futures that hung in the balance, waiting for them to be brave enough to claim them. Let's end this, she whispered, her voice filled with resolve. Let's make sure he gets to be real. The bunker walls reverberated with distant explosions, each one a reminder that time was running out. Leora's body felt heavy, as if the weight of all the possible futures she had seen had settled on her shoulders. Her mind raced through the vision snapshots of a peaceful life, a child's laughter, and the warmth of a home that had never existed but felt more real than anything else. She had glimpsed what they were fighting for, but the path to get there seemed impossibly fraught with danger. We need to regroup, Isaac said, snapping her back to the present. His voice was steady, though his eyes betrayed the fear simmering beneath the surface. We need to plan our next steps and make sure everyone understands what's at stake. Dr. Rhea had gathered the remaining rebels in the central chamber of the bunker. It was dim, lit only by flickering overhead lights and the glow of a makeshift map on the table. The rebels were exhausted, their faces lined with fatigue and despair, but there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes, one that had not been there before. We saw something, Liora began, her voice carrying across the room. The group fell silent, every eye on her. We saw a future where we win, where we break the cycle. It's not going to be easy, but it's possible. We have to hold on to that. A murmur spread through the room, a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. One of the rebels, a young woman named Talia, stepped forward. Her eyes were red, tears threatening to spill over. Do you really think we can change this? That we can stop all of this suffering? Isaac nodded, his gaze steady. We do. We've seen what's at stake. And we've seen the cost of failure. He looked at Liora, his expression softening. We have to be willing to sacrifice everything if we want to win. This is our only shot. Dr. Rhea approached the table, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the map. The memories you accessed. They showed us what needs to be done, she said. We have to disable the enemy's central command. It's the only way to disrupt their power structure and give us a chance to push back. Leora's heart pounded as she looked at the map. It was marked with red and blue symbols, the lines of battle clearly drawn. The enemy's command center was deep in the heart of the city, surrounded by layers of defense. It was a near impossible task, but they had no choice. How do we even get close? One of the rebels asked, his voice tinged with doubt. They have drones, guards. It's a fortress. Dr. Rhea looked at Liora and Isaac, her eyes filled with determination. That's where the memories come in. You've seen it, haven't you? You know the way. Isaac exchanged a glance with Liora, and she nodded. In one of the visions, they had seen themselves navigating through the ruins, slipping past guards, and making their way to the heart of the enemy stronghold. It had been a fleeting, fragmented memory, but it was enough. We know the way, Isaac said. We just have to trust what we saw. Liora took a deep breath, stepping closer to the table. She traced her finger along the path she remembered, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. We'll take a small team. Fewer people means less chance of being detected. We'll get in, disable the command center, and give the rest of you the signal to move in. The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Talia stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to come. I want to help make this right. Leora looked at her, seeing the fear in her eyes but also the determination. She nodded. Okay, but understand this. Once we start, there's no turning back. We're all in, no matter what. Talia nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. I understand. Isaac placed a hand on Leora's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. We can do this, he said softly. We have to. For him, for all of them. Leora closed her eyes, picturing the boy from her vision, his bright smile, his innocent eyes. She thought of the future they were fighting for, the peace that seemed so close yet so far away. She opened her eyes, her gaze hardening. Let's end this, she said, her voice filled with determination. For the future we saw, for the life we all deserve. The rebels nodded, a collective resolve settling over the group. They began to prepare, gathering weapons and supplies, their movements quick and purposeful. There was no more room for doubt, only action. As Liora and Isaac made their final preparations, she looked at him, her heart swelling with love and fear. No matter what happens, she said, her voice barely a whisper, I'm glad I have you by my side. Isaac smiled, his eyes softening. Always, he said. We'll see this through together. And with that, they stepped out of the bunker, the echoes of war growing louder around them. The path ahead was uncertain, the dangers immense, but they had hope. And as long as they had hope, they had a chance. The night was dark as pitch, the only light coming from the distant fires and the occasional burst of flares from the enemy's perimeter. Liora, Isaac, Talia, and two other rebels, Jared and Alia, moved in silence, their breaths shallow and tense. Each step they took towards the enemy's command center felt like a march deeper into fate. The streets were eerily empty, yet every shadow felt like it harbored unseen threats. Leora's heart raced, her senses heightened to every sound: the soft scuttle of a rat in the rubble, the faint hum of a distant drone, the rhythmic pounding of her own heartbeat. Isaac led the way, his hand held up as he motioned for them to stop, crouching low behind a broken wall. In the distance, they saw the first of the enemy patrols. 3 soldiers, their helmets reflecting the faint light of a flickering street lamp, moved methodically down the street. Leora held her breath, watching as Isaac signaled for the team to wait. They couldn't afford a firefight, not here, not now. As the soldiers passed, Isaac motioned again, and they moved silently, slipping through the darkness like ghosts. Talia was right behind Leora, her breath trembling slightly. Leora glanced back at her, offering a reassuring nod. Talia gave a shaky smile, her resolve still strong despite the fear that gripped them all. They reached the edge of the enemy's perimeter, a high fence topped with barbed wire. Alia moved forward, her nimble fingers working quickly to cut through the wires, creating a gap just big enough for them to slip through. One by one, they passed through the opening, their movements fluid and deliberate. Beyond the fence, the enemy's command center loomed, a massive structure of steel and concrete, its windows darkened, the air around it filled with an ominous hum. Leora's stomach twisted as she stared at the building. This was it. Everything they had fought for, every sacrifice they had made, led to this moment. Isaac turned to the group, his voice barely audible. We go in, find the control room, and disable the systems. Once we're in, there's no turning back. Everyone ready? Nods all around. Leora felt the weight of the boy's smile from her vision, the warmth of his tiny hands in hers. She couldn't let that future slip away. She couldn't fail him. They moved towards the building, slipping in through a side entrance that Isaac had seen in his memory. The hallway was dark, the air thick with the smell of oil and machinery. They moved swiftly, Isaac in the lead, his eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Leora's heart skipped a beat. She motioned for the group to take cover, pressing herself against the wall, her hand on the weapon strapped to her side. The footsteps grew louder, then paused. Leora held her breath, her heart pounding. A flashlight beam swept through the hallway, and Leora's hand tightened on her weapon. She exchanged a glance with Isaac, who gave a small shake of his head. Not yet. The beam moved on, and the footsteps faded into the distance. Leora exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest easing. They continued on, moving deeper into the building, until they reached a large steel door marked with the words Control Center. Isaac stepped forward, his hands working quickly to bypass the electronic lock. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching into eternity as Leora kept watch, her eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. Finally, the lock clicked open, and the door swung inward. They slipped inside, the room bathed in the dim glow of monitors and control panels. Leora's eyes swept over the room. This was it. the heart of the enemy's operations. Isaac moved to the central console, his fingers flying over the controls. Jared, Alia watched the door, he ordered, his voice steady. Liora stood by his side, her eyes darting between the monitors. She could see the entire battlefield from here, the enemy's forces, their movements, their defenses. It was all laid out before them. We need to disable their communications and shut down their automated defenses, Isaac said, his voice calm but urgent. Once we do that, we can signal Dr. Ria and the others to move in. Liora nodded, her heart pounding. She moved to another console, her fingers working quickly to access the systems. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the machines and the click of their keyboards. The time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like a lifetime. Suddenly an alarm blared, the sound piercing the silence. Leora's heart lurched. They know we're here, she whispered, her eyes wide. Isaac's face was set in determination. Keep going. We're almost there. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, the sound growing louder. Jared and Alia moved to brace the door, their weapons ready. Leora's hands shook as she worked, her eyes darting between the console and the door. The vision of the boy filled her mind, his bright smile, his innocent eyes. She couldn't let that future slip away. Got it, Isaac shouted, his voice filled with triumph. Communications are down. Defenses are offline. Leora's heart swelled with hope. She reached for her radio, her voice trembling as she spoke. Dr. Ria, this is Liora. The defenses are down. Move in now. The radio crackled, and Dr. Ria's voice came through, filled with relief. Copy that, Liora. We're moving in. Hold your position. The door burst open, enemy soldiers pouring into the room. Jared and Alia opened fire, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Liora turned, her weapon raised, her fingers squeezing the trigger. The room erupted in chaos, the air filled with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. Isaac moved to her side, his eyes filled with determination. We have to hold them off until the others get here, he shouted over the noise. Liora nodded, her heart pounding. She fired at the soldiers, her hands steady despite the fear that gripped her. She thought of the boy, of the future they were fighting for. She couldn't let it end here. She wouldn't. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one an eternity as they fought, their backs against the wall. Leora's body ached, her arms heavy, but she refused to give in. She glanced at Isaac, his face set in grim determination, and she felt a surge of love for him. They were in this together no matter what happened. Suddenly the sound of shouting echoed down the hallway, and Leora's heart leapt. The rebels had arrived. The enemy soldiers turned, their attention diverted, and Liora seized the moment, her fingers squeezing the trigger one last time. The room fell silent, the smoke slowly clearing. Leora's breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling. She looked at Isaac, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment there was only silence, only the two of them, standing together in the aftermath. Dr. Ria entered the room, her eyes wide with relief. You did it, she said, her voice filled with awe. You actually did it. Liora felt a sob rise in her throat, her eyes filling with tears. She looked at Isaac, her heart swelling with love and hope. They had done it. They had broken the cycle. Isaac reached out, his hand closing around hers. For him, he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. For all of them. Liora nodded, tears streaming down her face. She thought of the boy, his bright smile, his innocent eyes. She thought of the future they had fought for, the future they had won, and in that moment she knew that all the pain, all the sacrifice had been worth it. They had done it. They had broken the cycle. And now finally they had a chance to build the future they had dreamed of.